Ignite your curiosity with Austin Next. We're watching Austin transform from a thriving ecosystem into a global superstar. With our host, Jason Scharf, we aspire to better comprehend the true nature of innovation. Together, we will uncover what makes a successful ecosystem and navigate the technologies shaping our future. Now let's dive into what's next.
The evolution of war games into risk games. Is suffering and greatness linked? What does a paint shop open at 4 a.m. tell us about innovation ecosystems? These are just a few of the topics we dive into today. The origin of this episode was my desire to better understand the current tension between tech and media. Danny Crichton, having lived both sides, I thought would be the perfect person to ask. Danny analyzes science, technology, finance, and the human condition as editor-in-chief of securities and head of editorial at Lux Capital, a venture capital firm investing in emerging and growth stage science and technology ventures. Previously, he was managing editor at TechCrunch as well as a foreign correspondent based in Seoul, South Korea. For several years, he was an early stage VC investor with General Catalyst in Palo Alto and Charles River Ventures in Boston and New York. After graduating Stanford with honors in mathematical and computational sciences, he was awarded a Fulbright research scholarship to South Korea, where he investigated the country's modern industrial policy for startup innovation. Danny, thanks for coming on Austin Next.
Jason, it's good to hear from you.
I thought, if you keep hearing you on different podcasts and you're never answering the questions that I want, it'd be just easy to bring you on here and pepper you myself.
Well, as a journalist for multiple years, I'm usually the one asking the questions. And so I don't like being in the hot seat.
Well, I'll try to be, gentle and only a couple of softballs and then the occasional zinger, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I want to start off. I think it's an interesting journey going from being the managing editor of TechCrunch to being head of editorial at Lux Capital, and kind of jumping that, from being covering tech to you explain what exactly head of editorial means at a VC firm. So can you kind of walk me through that jump and what that means?
Yeah, I mean, my career is very bizarre in that I started in venture capital, joined TechCrunch, went back to venture capital, went back to TechCrunch, and went back to venture capital. So I did the VC to TC to VC to TC to VC career path. And I think I'm at the end of that. I think you shouldn't keep doing the same thing over and over again and make it sound like a DNA strand. But I started as an investor. So I started at General Catalyst, was at Charles River Ventures, now full-time writer over at Lux. And, to me, the reason that any venture firm generally builds out an editorial practice, right, is to bring more founders and investors around the table, right? They want to get their brand out there. They want to be known for things. It's a competitive ecosystem, right? There are thousands of new venture capital firms compared to when I started in 2012. I wouldn't have known it at the time. It's only something you can appreciate in retrospect, but it was a very small market. You could meet every venture capitalist. I mean, it was actually possible. You could meet every single person who directly invested in private equity in startups around Silicon Valley and Boston. That is impossible today. And so you need
that's why it was talked about Sand Hill Road. It was literally, they were all on one street.
It was very clubby. And look, it's great that it's opened up. But it was very clubby. But the reality is you could know everyone in a way that is impossible today. And so editorial departments, I think, have come up widely over the last couple of years. Every firm has its own approach. Some focus on video and TikTok, some focus on imagery, graphs, analysis. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it. My focus has always been kind of at the center of what Lux focuses on, which is around deep tech, hard sciences, and the intersection with policy. So focusing on things like wargaming simulations and trying to understand emerging tech over the next 5 years and what that might influence in DC and state capitals and around the world.
So, but I feel like we've seen an acceleration of the media, right? So as you've said, it's a lot about the branding, and maybe it's been that there's hundreds to thousands of VC firms now, but it's on such a scale. I mean, you've got, Andreessen has almost like a network of podcasts and newsletters. Founders Fund, Pirate Wires is coming out of that and doing a lot of, amazing stuff, to even like Arena Magazine, coming out of 8VC over the last couple of weeks. Is it accelerating now and they're almost becoming their own things? I feel like it's evolving past this brand building stage.
It is. I mean, I think early on it was very content marketing driven, and a lot of folks who were hired were content marketers. There was a second wave of folks who, were alums of Wired, TechCrunch, where there was a little bit more focus on journalism, not necessarily on the investigative side, but this idea of reporting, originality, trying to really focus on writing things that people hadn't read before. And then I think what's happened over the last couple of years, you've seen this since COVID, and I would argue maybe dating back to the crypto world, where there was this intersection all of a sudden between politics and tech.
Mhm.
The largest companies, Google, Facebook, started facing congressional inquiries. You could date that to 2016 with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, and the election. And so, suddenly Silicon Valley wasn't this sort of island on the other coast, completely divorced and away from DC and regulators and antitrust and FTC and SEC and all these different areas. As we started investing in categories like financial services, crypto, you started looking at chips, and you started having the rise of China. DC policymakers got really involved in this, and so everything you're sort of talking about, every firm you just mentioned, it's interesting because they are all focused on that intersection. As am I, which is you can't just sort of sit back and say wait for the regulators to come to you. You have to shape that agenda and actually have a conversation and try to open it up and saying, look, we do really open innovation. It's important that continues because that's good for America, and that doesn't always get reported in the press in DC.
So your point is it's this kind of now evolution we're seeing of the go direct and the opening up the communication pathways. So it's not just the founders themselves getting. I think I've seen the combination of partially the platforms are used as the communication ways for the founders to talk and
Mhm.
getting out there and being able to get their message out to like the Ben and Mark show and them getting a chance to talk to I think what the original point of securities, which was the old name of risk gaming, was I remember a couple of maybe like a year or two ago, maybe give me that it was diving into the quarterly Lux LP letter and really getting out like this is our vision of the future. This is so less. I mean, maybe I'm wrong on the less policy, but just really laying out this is how we see the world going and really understanding the vision and being able to something between brand building and kind of a building of the vision and future, right? Like that kind of that line between policy and attracting the deal flow.
Yeah, I mean, I would say over the last couple of years, obviously, there's been a lot more negativity in tech, across the board.
Right.
There's more negativity coming in from the media, from a lot of longtime tech folks. And look, when you're in the industry a long time, waves come back to you, right? So when I first started, AI was still hot back 10 years ago because you had the rise of Siri and some of these early assistants, Alexa, Google, and you were like, okay, this is the cusp of the new AI revolution. And it was not. Right. And so you have this jadedness that comes in from being in the industry a long time. And I think you see that with a lot of the ways that firms have responded to. So there's a lot of hostility, there's a lot of aggression, there's a lot of anger about sort of the regulatory aspects. And I think for Lux in particular, our approach is to have that little bit more of an optimistic tune. We're very focused on the hard sciences in a way that I think most firms are not. And I mean, science is really the pursuit of new knowledge, the pursuit of progress. It is a remarkable story that hasn't ended. Every year, we're learning more about how the world works. We're building new products. We're improving people's lives. And so, a little bit of it is, I would call it vibing. I guess that's the hot term these days, but you could call it brand building. But I just think of it as there has to be a voice that's saying, look, the world's not that terrible. There are bad things going on, but there are also solutions that are coming out of research laboratories and independent scientists that have the ability to completely change the world. I mean, when I started 3 years ago, GLP-1s weren't even on the market, and now millions of people are taking advantage of Wegovy and others out there, and something like diabetes, which was a critical health factor for millions and millions and millions of people, has this almost a solution. And
Right.
that's like, yes, that was like a 10-year, 15-year horizon. COVID, we had vaccines. We went from no vaccines to having a massive vaccine. And Moderna had worked for 10 years on mRNA platforms to be able to go do this. But when we needed it, was there. And so I feel like part of my job is always to sort of say, look, yes, the FTC has its little quandaries every day and we have these fights. But look at the big picture. We have an amazing apparatus for progressing human knowledge. And we should just enjoy that and like really accept that.
Where are you seeing? I mean, I would agree with you that the general media and the general tech media, which I find really interesting, has leaned hard into negativity recently, especially against the tech industry itself. And you're kind of seeing this clash between, now that I'd say the tech industry has found a direct voice, whether it's through these new media or just through their own whether it be social media or whatever. Where are you seeing this kind of the origin of it? Is it these waves? Is it something more existential? Just because like we saw this kind of early on with, oh, Google and Facebook are changing our business models, and I'm going back to Craigslist. And now it's existential threats and getting worse, and it started there. Or is it purely political driven? Like, where do you see as the kind of solve the whole quandary for me here?
Well, look, you have to go back. There's a very robust press in the '90s, which came with .com. There's a bunch of publications that don't even exist anymore, but who, sort of chronicled the rise of Silicon Valley 1.0, if you will, and the .com 1.0, and then they all died off, right? So we had the .com crash. There was no media to focus on. There were no ads. There was no events. And then we had the rise of a whole new set of publications, one of which was TechCrunch, founded in '05. And that happened to be roughly the same time that Facebook got started. And so, from I would say 2005 to 2015, there's this remarkable decade of sort of positivity around tech, right? And it aligns with Obama and the idea of the internet freedom agenda, and it arrived with the Arab Spring. And there really felt like this notion in the best way of the internet of like, look, we're just connecting people together on social through technology. They're becoming peaceful. They're overthrowing autocratic dictatorships. It's an amazing like moment in history. It was so positive. And I think by 2015, 2016, the longer term effects of a lot of this technology started to become much more visible, right? A billion people were on Facebook. They weren't all sharing recipe ideas and fun, child photos. There became like a serious set of problems for everything from terrorism to, multinational criminal finance to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't ignorable anymore. That's A. B, Google IPOs in '04, Facebook eventually IPOs in 2012. These companies got huge. I mean, in some ways, we still sort of feel like they're startups, and I mean, I say that because I grew up with these companies. Like, I remember I joined Google in 2011. I think I was employee like 13,000, and at the time, like that was a big number. I'm now in like the first 2-3% of the company in terms of the number of employees. Google who has 100,000 plus employees,
Right. Google's
and
coming
people
up on
turnover.
almost 30 years old now, isn't it? Like,
Right.
pretty,
1995. Right. So
yeah,
yes, we're almost at 30 years old. So, these are now multi-trillion dollar, the world's largest companies, billions of users. And I think there was this sort of change in the industry where it's just like, look, we haven't even scrutinized these companies. And once people started opening the door and looking around, journalists and investigators, they were like, whoa, there's a bunch of stuff going wrong. And, you saw that with Cambridge Analytica. And I think Facebook probably got the brunt of this. Facebook is where the story really changed more than I think Google and a bunch of others. And it hasn't stopped. And so I think when the media side, you had this positive decade from '05 to 2015, then there was this sort of blowback, which is like, wow, we haven't been investigating you. We really have a lot to catch up on. And it just so happens there was a lot to catch up on, and there were a lot of good investigations, and things broke. And so, we're kind of in this weird muddle, right? Which is some people are going direct and saying, I don't want to go through the media. They're gatekeepers. They're negative. They're going to position everything horrifically. So I want to do it myself. You have, I would say, insidery kind of TechCrunch original kind of publications like Eric Newcomer's, where it's like, I'm an insider. I know what's going on. I'm not going to frame everything negatively because I actually kind of get the politics and what's happening. You have ones like The Information, which are a little bit more traditional investigative, but are also sort of insidery. And obviously of the traditional press, which tends to be still hostile. So what's nice is today, I feel like tech has a much more broad spectrum of coverage. You have stuff that's very positive, stuff that's very negative, everything in between. And that's ultimately healthy in a freedom of speech kind of marketplace of ideas context.
right. No, I mean, maybe it's the things that get amplified and loud because it's. I'll be honest, from my perspective, it's hard to see the things in the more traditional, and I'll say more traditional tech, right? And some of the things even that you've mentioned that are even on the positive side, right? Like I've had some of the stuff when you see like the SpaceX Starship launches, and they're like, "This is a complete failure." Like, what?
Right. Yes.
This is complete failure, or some of the stuff that came out, when you had the, I try not to cuss on the podcast, but like, when I forget, and this was in TechCrunch, when I think it was when Alex Wang's at Scale
Hmm.
AI was
Hmm.
like his MEI, and someone was like, you can F all the way off or something, and it was like,
Hmm. Hmm.
what are we talking? Like, this is not, and I'm all for, I like creative destruction. I like disruptive. I think it was very interesting to watch, the whole thing with like Google and Gemini and OpenAI and Perplexity. And you're like, man, if Clayton Christensen was alive today, he'd be like, and this is exactly what happens in this scenario, like this
Right.
is.
Right.
So like, it's one of those questions of like, do you actually need regulation, or like, are we going to see Google go the way of Kodak? Because when you can say like, hey, Kodak invented digital cameras, Google invented GPTs, and then put it on the shelf, just like Kodak put digital cameras on the shelf. Like, this is a pretty textbook case kind of situation. So, and that's an interesting story to kind of dig into. But then you just still have this kind of very hostile lack of depth. I feel like that gets amplified, and that's some of the cases where one of the things on social media and those kind of things that you have an amplification effect, right? Which you have lots of people piling on in any sort of direction, which might be actually something that's like, we could have all just ignored it.
Yes. Well, look, I will say, and I was at TechCrunch 2017, late 2017 through end of 2021, which, that was pre-COVID. This was the SaaS bubble, crypto bubble. I mean, it was bubble central. I mean, frankly, and, we were covering Luck and Coffee over in China, growing from 0 to 20,000 stores in 12 months. I mean, there was sort of this insanity of the Vision Fund at SoftBank and a lot of the crypto stuff that kind of went up and down. And you have to remember this was sort of post Elizabeth Holmes. SPF was coming up. Obviously a little bit too early, but a year earlier than that. The big question is like
I think people
there
could probably hear me roll my eyes,
yeah,
exactly.
exactly. No, I mean, I think the big challenge in this last couple of years has been this divide between the level of capital that's going into some of these companies and their actual performance of what comes out, right? And I
Right.
feel like one of the first stories, and this was a Bloomberg story, was the Juice Row story, right? Here was this company that made juice at home with these flavor packs, and it had raised hundreds of millions of dollars.
And you could just
And
squeeze
basically,
it.
it was a glorified pressing device.
Yeah.
And when that video came out was sort of, I think, when the spell really broke. It was actually not Theranos. It was not necessarily some of the other scandals. It was really Juice Row that was the one that was like, this is bullshit hype. It's
Yep.
complete hype. And there's a complete divide between the hundreds of millions being spent on one and the actual performance of the product in the other. And again, this was a difference. I mean, go back to Google's founding. You had 2 PhDs in library science, focus on how to basically calculate the grand sum of human knowledge in the Library of Congress. They got an NSF grant in library science, not a popular field, because they needed to organize information. And that's what their PhD's dissertations were on. So these were hackers. These were people who built products. These were people who built a tool that, as much as people complain about Google, is still one of the most epically amazing products that humanity's ever built. The ability to search all of human knowledge instantaneously and get a result in milliseconds is incredible. To kind of this modern world of D2C brands and juiceros and all these products that sort of got invented. And I mean, there's even been ones in the last year you can probably think of that have raised hundreds of millions for new products that basically went kaput 6 months later. And it's just sort of that insanity and that gap, I think, has really triggered a lot of cynicism for folks.
But do you then think that the vibe pendulums, as we've seen, right? That you see the juicers, then you have people who go, oh my God. But the people who have the ability to make changes is then why we're seeing this sudden surge of hard tech, defense tech, deep tech, critical, whatever you want to call these type of, we're going to actually do something that changes it, surge that we've seen over the last whatever time period that you want to see.
Yes, people. I think people, and particularly like a newer generation of folks who are just entering the industry, I have noticed a sea change where, look, they've actually gone through 3 bubbles even in their lifetimes, right? These bubbles happen so quickly. We went through, the crypto bubble. We went through the COVID bubble. SaaS bubble, and that was like a 5-year period of time. Like you went through your senior year of high school and college, and you went through 3 bubbles. That's how fast things were turning over. And so I think people are going back to a more fundamental question of, am I building something that can last 15, 20 years? I mean, I hear that from a lot of 22-year-olds, and that is very different from when I grew up, where no one spoke in those sorts of lengths, right? It was always, I mean, I graduated in 2011. The App Store gets launched in 2009. Everyone was focused on apps, advertising, Zynga, games. It was all about these quick hits. It was like, look, you can go onto the App Store, build something, flip it for 100 million. If you're younger than me, Instagram's founders come from my world, and you sold for $1 billion. That was the dream. And I think that from a younger generation, the folks that I hang out who are, just graduating college or entering the workforce, a lot of them are talking about building sort of lifelong companies. They're like, this is my one and done. I want this to be, they're looking at folks like Jensen Huang, who's been building NVIDIA since the early 90s. I mean, we're not even talking about 30, we're talking about 35 years, right? I mean, he has spent decades building this company. And there are a couple other heroes, if you will, like that. And I think folks are looking up to them and saying, look what he's been able to build. It's just like working over and over and continuing on that process. So there's less of that fail quickly, lean startup, throw 100 things against the wall, as soon as it fails, sort of drop the company and move on to something else. And much more of a, hey, this is my shot. I'm going to make it in that kind of Hamilton song like way.
Right. And Jensen, to your point, had a vision of a particular thing. And that's
Yes.
the difference. It wasn't this hype cycle, that hype cycle, this switch. I mean, the whole point about like everybody who ran into crypto, who's now running into AI, and like I went from my crypto to .ai versus Jensen's like, no, this is the thing that I need to build. And while it has a gaming utility today, it has this. And I know the day we're recording this, we're all waiting for the NVIDIA's
Yes.
earnings call. Like somebody actually posted this on X, and it makes points that it has as much impact as a jobs report right
Yes.
now.
Yes. And they can't even release a jobs report on time. If you follow the whole scandal over the bureau,
The
they
revision
posted 30 minutes late.
Yeah, the revision.
There was a whole thing. No, I mean, look, and NVIDIA came out of nowhere. Look, I covered NVIDIA during the crypto wave. I was the NVIDIA beat reporter for TechCrunch, if you will. And look, I saw it go up. Believe it or not, I believe it peaked at something like 90. This is years ago, but 90, 100 billion bucks. It went back down to like 30. It lost 60, 70% of its value in 3-4 months. Go back to history. I'm probably off on all those numbers, but relatively speaking. And so it's always one of those things where it's like, here we go again. Like it's all the way up. And does that get supported long-term by revenues, by the fundamentals, or is that just hype? And we're going to go all the way back down the cycle again and lose 70%. It's done that multiple times. That's what's fascinating about NVIDIA to me, is like one of these like arch bets of history of like, it has Jensen Huang's best ability, if you listen to all of his interviews, it's not so much that he has this keen eye for strategy, whatever the case may be. I think that's there. The key piece is NVIDIA nearly collapsed multiple times, like up to and quite frankly more recently. And SoftBank actually bails it out to a certain degree during that period where the Vision Fund puts billions of dollars into NVIDIA. And that was actually one of its okay returns compared to the rest of the fund. And so, I mean, it's always this ability to find a path through the wilderness that they were able to do. But it's not like a Google, where Google never had a bad year. I mean,
didn't Sun say that like one of their worst mistakes is they actually sold the video too early?
They did. I mean, what's nuts, what's actually funny, and this is the challenge of power laws, is like they had a very serious stake in NVIDIA. They had billions and billions as a stake. And if they actually had sold now at the $3 trillion price, we wouldn't even be questioning the Vision Fund in general. I mean, it really would be like a remarkable success. All the $100 billion of bad investments would not have mattered.
Right. Well, I actually want to get back to something you said with the 3 bubbles from someone who was like from graduating to their college years. And it's something I've thought about, that we talk about how amazing the increase in adoption of technology has been, right? Like it was like, electricity, I'm making up numbers. Like electricity was like 50 years, television was whatever, Instagram was, 10 years, and then ChatGPT was 5 days, right? Whatever those numbers were, they were getting faster and faster. But I wonder if this is the negative side effect of, we all went crazy on crypto. And I remember hearing about like NFTs, I think right before the Beeple auction. And hearing like as an interesting, and I think it was on a podcast. It was as an interesting idea for artists to attach value as the piece of art gained in value. Like there was the royalty. And I was like, that's a really interesting way for artists to maintain and continue to get right. I'd never really been in the blockchain and crypto space, and then all of a sudden like people happen, and then like, oh my god, right? It was this, and people were flipping, and it went absolutely crazy, right? And then ChatGPT and all the rappers and all these kind of stuff. And is this then the negative side effect of our tightly knit technology culture, whatever, that we have this amazing ability to spread technology, spread these stories so quickly, and we have this rapid adoption that things aren't able. It's this kind of like the Gartner hype cycle, like crunched into weeks instead of years, that we don't give things time to marinate. And so we might be like, oh well, now NFTs are a bad word, or like, I mean, no one says ICOs anymore. Maybe they were actually interesting, but they became terrible so quickly.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at, I mean, this is one of the interesting markets. If you think of like, what could Austin's place be in the global startup community, right? Which is hype cycles get built so quickly around companies. And it's not a good thing in many ways, right? When I think of companies and from a Lux Capital perspective, roughly a third of our investments are in biotech, as an example. Like biotech's a very different world. There's no hype in bio in the same way, both because it's quite unethical and there's a bunch of whole issues of trying to hype new therapies too early when you haven't had any research data. But the reality is it's a very competitive market. And so everyone's very stealthy. Nothing gets announced. Nothing is public. You might build a company for 5 years without anyone even knowing you exist. And so, whereas in Silicon Valley, the model is you go to the YC demo day, you try to hype it as much as possible. You try to get that splashy front page TechCrunch story, you get $100 million, $200 million valuation, et cetera, and you go for the moon. Unfortunately, you're still a 6-month-old company. And I do think that there's this leap where people are sort of expecting the next Google to be identified in the first couple of months of a company's existence. And that to some degree is what venture capital is about. And some of this is a function of the fact that there are so many VCs and they're talking and they're on Twitter or X, they're on LinkedIn. But I do think that where Austin or some of these smaller markets can come in is to say, look, you need a playground, you need to experiment, you need to be able to be in the laboratory. You are onto something, but you haven't found it. You might have quote unquote product market fit, but it's like that loose, like you're just on top of it, but it's not perfect. Even Google, it looks like such a success early on. It was not figured out for several years, right? PageRank ended up having a huge amount of challenge around scaling. And so you need to develop this idea around computer science known as MapReduce to be able to actually process this in the servers. And then there became an issue about business models. And then AdWords had to be the solution around business models. There were all these additional technologies that had to get built in order for Google to be the success that it was today. And I feel like a lot of entrepreneurs, they just, because they're on the press tour so early, the pressure on them to succeed, like you basically hit the clock, and now people are looking. And I do think there's an incredible amount of power of just being stealthy, focused on building, not dealing with any of those meetings, not pitching, not selling, getting some design customers. And that's one of the reasons why I think if you look at the results in the last couple of years, I mean, the enterprise results have been stronger than consumer, right? Because consumer has been so focused on marketing and PR. But in enterprise, you usually have the design customer centric model. You spend a couple of years with a couple of key customers. You build them up. They become your sort of lighthouses. You sell to everyone else based on the fact that they joined and they're using you. And you have companies like Datadog. You have, kind of marketing automation companies that have been very successful, like Klaviyo. And, no one ever talks about Klaviyo. Not a very exciting company. We did a profile of them for TechCrunch, but it was one of those where it's like, here's a Boston-based company, 10 billion. I don't know where their valuation is. It's probably a mess right now, but the CEO owns a third because he husband cash. He didn't raise a bunch, grew it to a massive revenue. At one point, it was absolutely a 10 billion plus market cap company. Don't know where it is today. And it's like, look, there's nothing flashy, but it was just a very strong focus on product development. And there's an answer to that, which is you want to be in the lab longer, you want to just state longer, and I agree with you 100%.
So I'm going to push, giving some context. My background's all in biohealth, so I've spent my entire career in that. And it was an interesting comment you made about like you be a little more stealthy, you're a little more in that. I think it's Evolved Bio. Is that the one you guys led with
Yep.
the model? And so it's funny because I felt like you guys came out very hyped, very loud, and so it's really kind of the opposite. But I wonder if that's and you want to talk a little bit about what that company is because, but is that more because it's the nature of bio companies are changing a little bit, and that feels more like a tech company in some ways than a traditional clinical asset type of company?
It is a different type of company, and you're identifying something very specific, which is you got to recruit. And the big issue so in Evolved Technology is about using AI and bio, built around a couple of key kind of AI models there, and the talent in the world that can do that. I mean, there's only a couple of hundred, couple of thousand folks who are qualified, and obviously a couple dozen that you really want on that team early on. And so one of the biggest challenges is that in traditional biotech, very tight networks in South San Francisco and Boston. There are ways of recruiting. And in that model, you generally have either professors or chief science officers who get the first 20 people inside the front door. In Silicon Valley, the talent market for AI engineers today is so keenly competitive that you have to hype. I mean, there's just nothing you can do. You
Hmm.
have to be out there. It is so impossibly hard to be stealthy in AI, offering competitive salaries with OpenAI, with Perplexity, with Anthropic, with all these different companies out there. And you have to have like that brand. So you do need to attract that, and both on terms of talent, and then I would say, frankly, you want the follow-on round. So if you're quiet, people just assume there's nothing interesting happening there, which is why so many people have engaged in open source. So many people try to demonstrate with demos. You are trying to create a hype cycle so that people are saying, look, there's real progress. You're on the cutting edge. You're staying up to date. This is a winning ticket. The train's leaving the station. Do you want to get on board?
Right.
And whereas in biotech, because of the way, and particularly clinical biotech, because of phase one, phase two, there's these checkpoints that are just sort of built into the system where it's like, look, no one's going to come in until phase one is done. You got nothing. And if you need more money, it's your existing investors who generally have to pocket that cash, because who's going to do it 4 months before the phase one trial data comes in? You're not going to do that. That's a dumb decision.
There's no new technical risk that's taken off
There's
the
no
table
data.
until you've done right.
There's no data, right? It's not like a social app where you have, cohort data, and every day you're collecting millions of data points. Biotech, it's, maybe 20 people enrolled in a phase one trial for safety.
Yeah.
I mean, think of the scale. There's just nothing there. And, once you get through that, then you have a big question of phase two. And people are a little bit more willing, including acquirers, to IPOs, to other investors, of saying, like, look, early clinical data that's not published, but maybe you have the first 25-30% of the enrollees, are sort of complete, and there's some positive data, and you're willing to say, yeah, I have some data now to work on making a decision otherwise. But look, investors aren't dumb. Why would they make a decision if there's nothing new under the table?
Right. No, it makes a lot of sense. I want to pivot a little bit to your other title. I know we sort of on the vibes in the media, but head of risk gaming.
Mhm.
So tell me about risk gaming, and is it different than wargaming and scenario planning, or is it we're owning back to our vibes and branding here? We're creating a Lux term.
It's definitely a lineage of wargaming. I mean, one of the reasons we call it risk gaming instead of wargaming, because it doesn't always involve war, and in fact, it mostly doesn't involve war. And so, this idea of like troops on the battlefield is an image we don't want people to have. We're not moving little figurines in some sort of weird. I know you're looking at me with 500 board games on shelves behind my head, but it has nothing to do with little figures. It's strategic wargaming, and so it felt easier to come up with a new term. And interestingly, in the industry, people have ideas like foresight games and prediction games and speculation models. And there are actually a lot of folks are trying to get away from the word wargaming for a variety of reasons. I would say that the key difference for us, so obviously the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, and particularly the Naval War College have all been very, very focused on using this as a tool to, improve your strategic acumen, to simulate scenarios you can't experience. So even if we're not at war, you have experience, hopefully, to go fight those in the future. I'd say the key difference for us is a couple fold. One is a real focus on empowering people to make decisions under the context of incentives. So the Pentagon sort of assumes there are no incentives in the world. Economics doesn't exist. You're modeling kind of troops that showed up on the battlefield and they will fight and you do your sort of thing, or you do state-to-state actors, but they never get the economics into play. So there's never a sense of, look, we could do this, but Google's profits are going to be affected, and Google's a really important American company, and so we're not going to do that. That never shows up. Like economic, corporate, private industry concerns rarely show up in American foreign policy. And so one of the things we try to add back into this as economic warfare has become more important in every region around the world is sort of asking, like, look, what happens if you have this policy? These are the ramifications to jobs, right? And would you sacrifice 4 million jobs, American jobs of employment because of a trade embargo? And suddenly you're adding in all these dimensions that actually exist in real life that just don't get simulated generally in DC wargaming simulations. That's one. Two, there's a lot of groupthink that comes with the way that the games are done in DC. So the traditional red team model is like 8 people are on the US side, 8 people are on the red team side. They kind of have a meeting and then they make a decision. And I just don't think that's very interesting. I think groupthink is the death of all interesting decision making. And so one of the things we really focus on is everyone is a decision maker. Everyone's a CEO, a congressman, a president, an actual actor who makes decisions, which means that when you actually play these games, you can get some really interesting emergence behavior. So suddenly I can be an asshole. I can suddenly be like, you really screwed me on that last decision. And even though it's not good for me, I'm going to get back at you. And I don't have to get a committee of people being like, don't do that. Like, that's bad for our points or scores or objectives. I'm like, no, I'm getting back at you.
Because there's no emotion in the real world.
There's no emotion.
Right.
Exactly. And I think one of the things, we've had a lot of prominent people play this, and, you might assume that prominent, you have a senator playing or whatever, that they're going to be, I don't know, that kind of stentorial, this statesman, and they get angry. You just don't realize they're human just like everyone else. They're losing or they're falling behind. Someone just, pulled a fast one on them and they get pissed. And when you read history, and I'm a huge fan, obviously, of history, but you realize that even the most famous people, presidents that are, lionized on statues all across our great land, are real people. They get pissed, they get happy, they have, the whole range of human emotions, and they make decisions from those emotions. In some cases, you just get pissed off and you're like, I am going to get that guy no matter what it takes. And even that's a bad decision.
I'll never forget this. It was just a simple thing. So my father and I are playing. So my son is playing chess against my father and I. So he's playing the 2 games against us. And so we're doing a shot clock. And this is the first time I'd ever played kind of like the double chess. And my son is better than us. And I've never, the only way I can describe is I went on tilt. I made a blunder. Like I somehow I miscalculated like where my angle was. And we had a 5-second countdown to move. And he's just standing there going 5, 4. And it was just like, it was so, I can understand these things. It was so unbelievably downhill from there of just like, every move was just terrible, everything. And you can understand the emotion of anything. And this was like a stupid game of chess. Let's just say like, I didn't last much longer after that. Like he just decided to clean up, but yeah, you can understand like when emotion gets involved, and I was just completely frustrated and completely lost it at that. I was like, I'm never doing that again. And it was a simple chess game, right? And you're talking about like complex, scenarios.
Josh over here at Lux likes to say, chips on shoulders, but chips in pockets. But I think of it as you look at academia.
I've seen him tweet that quite often.
He says that once or twice. We should just have a cardboard cutout in our lobby that repeats refrains. But what I would emphasize is, in academia, you see empirical social science. We have all the statistics. A lot of war games get built by researchers, analysts, so they're very quantitative, very numerical. And I think these games are shorn of that human element, which is, look, sometimes people go to war just because they're pissed off. And that sounds crazy. How is that empirical? That doesn't sound something that's statistical. Like, how does that work?
Well, if we go back to one of the most fundamental wars in literature, the Trojan War.
Right.
You stole my girl.
Right, exactly. Right. You go back to Iliad, you go back to the Odyssey. A lot of the Greek tragedy. I mean, you do have to go back to classics, right? And I'm a fan of the classics, and it's demoralizing how little the classics are still part of our society. But
Yeah.
I think one of the things that they get right compared to a lot of modern work is this concept of really understanding the psychologies of people. Sometimes it's greed, sometimes it's malice, sometimes it's ambition, sometimes there's all these different emotions, and people are driven by different things. And it's, yes, in some cases, I think people are driven by totally wholesome, positive emotions as you would like. Some people just want to make a bunch of money to have a massive house so they can basically go to their girlfriend that gave them up in high school and be like, look at me, fuck you, or boyfriend, or whatever the case may be. They have that chip that goes back 25 years. And you just don't see that. When I think of like modern American nonfiction, I think of this very analytical style that's like college writing. And what we don't teach in college, and I think I think it comes widely. You can see it on Twitter, you can see it in so many places, is we just don't get in people's heads. We don't analyze, we don't really consider why people do what they do. But if you look at Twitter, look at some of the people in our industry. I'm not going to name specific names in this context, but it's not so. Let's go with Elon Musk. He's the most fair to. He owns a site, so we can make fun of him. But Elon is like, he's clearly driven by a lot of things. You can't analyze him from that empirical, like, this is the rational decision he'll make. I think he just gets pissed off some days, and it's like yesterday was about launching Starfleet Academy.
But it does make an interesting thing, right? Because going back to like the Isaacson book, and it's something actually Josh Wolf's comment about chips and shoulders, right? And it is a question that has sat with me a lot, especially as a parent, which is suffering required for greatness? Because when I think about that a lot with and I'm putting this so you can send this to Josh after, because he hasn't. I've put this question to him whenever he tweets this, and he hasn't responded. So I'm putting this that I'm not because if chips on shoulders require puts chips in pockets, then as a father, I want my children to have a good life. I want them to be successful. It's kind of, you want those both things. I don't want them to suffer. And so you kind of have this. And I look at, a lot of the people who are successful, and you do see those suffer moments, whatever you want to kind of put it. If those two things go together, it's a hard thing to look at then.
I think if you have a very holistic definition of the word suffer, I think that makes sense. I don't think you have to materially suffer. In other words, Mark Zuckerberg comes from a very prominent middle-class father, I believe was a dentist. Bill Gates' father was a partner at a major law firm. He was one of the first to have access to a computer at a private high school. These weren't people who suffered. But what's interesting is they suffered psychologically in the sense that they felt inadequate with some of the performance that was coming from their parents, and they were running away. Right. They didn't want this, middle class lifestyle or the legal lifestyle. They were rebels. They fought back. And I do think that you do have to have that aspect of saying, like, look, there's a comfortable life. I can just click some boxes. I can go to Goldman or Bain or McKinsey. I graduate, I go to HBS. I graduate, I go to the partner track for 7-10 years. I probably make it somewhere. If not at the top, then I go to the second tier firms and I'll make partner there. And I have my life, and it makes a couple $1,000,000. Think of our rarefied world, but it makes a couple $1,000,000. You retire and you're going to have a great life. You have to rebel. That life was available to me, and yet here I am as a writer, making war games for General Centers or whatever. And that didn't come from listening to people. In almost all of my career decisions, everyone has told me I was wrong. And I just think you have to sometimes listen to everyone telling you, no, don't do that. You should continue working at Google. You'll love Google. And I didn't. And so I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go a completely different direction in my life. I left the country. Like, I didn't even stay in the United States. So you have to be willing to kind of walk away. And I do think that that's a rare quality, and we call it chips and shoulder, that kind of mentality of I have a reason to run. But I don't think you have to suffer materially, but you do have to suffer in that sense of, I just can't imagine the sheer tedium and boredom of a conventional lifestyle.
It does take a different kind. I had Mike Maples on the podcast, and going after his Pattern Breakers book, which is a lot of kind of that, your point, the different type of thinking and that non-obvious insight, and going like, whether we call it like contrarian or the willing to say like, I want to look different. I want to see, and a lot of people are telling you you're wrong. Now, in some cases, it's always hard to be like, you might be wrong.
Yes. Right.
But going
Well,
through when you're, and it takes into this, orthogonal thinking. And I'm using that terms. I know you guys had your little mini series called like orthogonal bets. And how are you seeing like the risk gaming applied? I mean, is it really, are you guys using it to get that linkage into the government? Or is that really the main usage? Is it helping Lux? Is it you bring it to your portfolio companies? Like where is, obviously the uses I've seen when you guys have put out there has been this kind of big, with the government, but how are you guys using it holistically?
I'd say we don't use it so much as in the individual scenario. Like the experience of the scenario doesn't necessarily expand in that way. It's hard to get people to just think contrarian. That's not something that just gets downloaded into your head. What I would say is I always try to get people to think 3 to 5 years in advance. So kind of a William Gibson, the future's already here, it's just not equally distributed.
You're right.
A lot of government officials obviously get stuck with the topic du jour. They have to do whatever's on the headlines on the front of the cover every single day. And what we just try to do is we're trying to say, look, here are the things that are coming around the corner, right? It might be autonomous warfare. It might be xenotransplantation. It might be the CRISPR revolution, CRISPR gene editing that's coming through finally into the commercial sector. It could be the next generation of small nuclear reactors that are coming up. You can keep on going on and on and on. And we just try to project that forward and say, well, what are the implications of that? Right. So if we have xenotransplantation, let's say we've had a couple of patients already who have had pig organs implanted them, have had success, have been on them for several dozen days. They're alive and they didn't otherwise have access to a kidney, a liver, or another organ. And so they lived. These are very expensive operations, mostly from the transplant, less than the organ, but they're very expensive operations. If there's suddenly no supply chain blockage on getting an organ, you don't have to wait for someone to be a donor and show up at the hospital and be somewhere nearby within the ischemic time. Suddenly, you could have millions of these a year. Not only could we have millions of these, we could be preventative. We could say, look, you're having liver cirrhosis, your kidneys are starting to fail. You don't have to wait until you're near death to get to the top of the list to be qualified for an organ. We can just do it tomorrow or next week. We can schedule it in advance. What would happen if we had to add another $1 trillion to America's Medicare and Medicaid costs? Right. These surgeries are about $2 million a piece. Imagine 1 million of these a year, or maybe 500,000 a year. That would radically change everything about medicine in the United States. And I mentioned this to a senator a couple months ago, and they were just like, I can't even begin to process that. Like, I don't even know. Like, we are barely able to handle the GLP-1 crisis. Like, Medicare is busting because of the price of GLP-1s. And I think it's really fascinating but more technologies like this are going to come and there's going to be demand. And how do you make it equitable? How do you make sure everyone has access to this in a fair way? And so, a huge part of what I think of risk gaming's potential is to say, look, let's get you projected a couple of years forward. Let's get you predictive, but not so speculative that we feel like we're in a William Gibson novel. We're not talking about gene editing and like you're going to upload your mind to the cloud. So we're not AGI is 5 years away. But let's just assume that ChatGPT just gets integrated in most industries. Like the technology that's here today, but it actually goes into customer service. What happens to different industries and how do those people adapt?
Well,
that's the potential.
One of the things that it drove me a little crazy was when the Vertex sickle cell CRISPR drug was approved. Mm-hmm. And the first article I read was it was about Medicaid going, I don't know if we're going to pay for this. Excuse me? This is a cure, yes, in essence, for sickle cell. We're starting to ask the wrong questions. We're starting to, this is something I rail about all the time, and I agree with, is now we're starting, it's square peg, round hole. We're starting to try to fit technologies and systems into legacy models that it don't fit. Your whole point, you said, we're barely containing the GLP-1 crisis. I'm like, well, hold on. Isn't obesity killing you right now? Yeah. Diabetes. You're starting to say, you're asking the wrong questions.
Well, then this is where I do think this is where risk gaming is interesting, right? Because on one hand, you have the idealism of I think a Silicon Valley where I build it, they will come. I built something amazing and it's worth a lot and people should pay an epic amount. And then you realize there are budget constraints. I mean, okay, if we want to cover a whole new form of medication we've never covered before, that's an extra $100 billion a year. That has to come from somewhere. Now, the US has been great about using debt to do that over the last couple of years. And the deficit's very scary to someone like me, who generally is on the more fiscally prudent side of the ledger. But what I would say
I think anybody, if you actually look at the numbers, it starts.
Yeah, exactly.
Just look at the number, and then you're like, math.
That seems like a lot
work
of money.
So
Yes.
not well. That's a
Yes,
lot of
exactly.
zeros.
And I what I love about what we try to do, or at least how I design all of the scenarios that I work on, it's those tough trade-offs where you're saying like, look, I can invest in the future, but I also have a crisis I have to deal with right now. And
Right.
when I think about America as a strategic entity or a company as a strategic entity, if you're Google, are you doubling down on search today? Are you trying to invest in AI in the future? What's that Waymo thing doing over there? Right? Like Waymo's been invested. I mean, think of how many dollars, et cetera, that Google has plopped into Waymo over the years. It seems like a very strategic bet. I think it's very smart. But that money could have been used to protect its search engine monopoly by investing in ChatGPT and LLMs much more heavily. And
Again,
that's
there's
always
this
the
book
question you have to
called
put up. Yes.
Innovator's Dilemma that had
Yeah,
quietly talked
exactly.
about this issue and why it's hard for large companies to do this.
And I think as you look at these companies, I mean, look, the scale is so much bigger. America's scale is so much bigger. The issues are just massive, right? More and more people are involved. You're talking about hundreds of millions, if not a billion users of some of these products. You just have to deal with more complexity, right? A ship getting turned around the Suez Canal blows out half of the U.S. economy because no goods can get carted from China to the U.S. Right now, we have the Houthis in the sea, in the Red Sea, targeting ships. We can't get everything. Everyone's going around the Cape of Good Hope, around Africa, adding time to every ship to Europe, to every ship to the US from China, and vice versa. You have these massive outages. You have CrowdStrike. No one ever thought about CrowdStrike until the day they decided to put a patch that blocked every doctor's office. My Delta flight, 4 days later, is in the doctor's office for my annual physical, and there's still half the computers still have blue screens of death in the lobby. I'm looking at their computer. Some of them were working, and I was like, wow, CrowdStrike hit here too. And they haven't even fixed it 4 days later. So, I mean, we have this integration, this complexity. And I think that there are trade-offs of look, you want to have a secure computer, but that security itself creates its own insecurity, right?
Well,
there's a repercussion to that decision of installing the first software, which is you've now created a new set of challenges to monitor and manage. And so where do you make that trade-off?
I think the last set a time frame, right? 30 years, whatever, of just in time, globalization, networks, whatever time frame you want to put, there were a whole lot of positive benefits, decrease, lower costs, larger markets, etc. And what we have found over the last 5 years is the delicateness, fragility, whatever words you want to use about it. And we just never thought that would be an issue. It was never built in. It was always like, it's not an issue. It's not a problem. And then, when COVID hit, and it seemed to have been a spiraling effect for whatever reason, right? Like, why did CrowdStrike happen now? Like, has there been additional kind of, supply chain? I'll use that very broadly in kind of both the physical and digital kind of phrasing that have shown just everything's fragile. And then one of the reasons we're bringing, again, bringing back to drugs and devices and things like that, we could have the most cutting edge drugs in the world, and if you can't make them or ship them, who cares?
Right. Well, and look, I mean, I think one of my theses of life is, in almost all cases, functionality has gone better, right? And what I mean by that is our houses are better than they were 40, 50 years ago. I mean, there's a housing crisis, there's a housing affordability crisis. A lot of people are asking, well, why are houses so expensive compared to they were 50 years ago? And go look at an original house from the 50s and compare it to a modern home. The AC, the HVAC is better, the materials tend to be better. The kind of poisonous materials that used to be there aren't there anymore. The fixtures are nicer. They tend to be bigger. Homes in the United States have expanded from something like 1,500 to 2,500 square feet on average over the last 40, 50 years. So you have more bedrooms, you have more car garages, you have a larger lawn. Of course, it's more expensive. We had a piece in the last quarterly letter for Lux that Josh wrote where he talks about how planes in World War II, we used to produce thousands and thousands of planes for the war effort, but there were only a couple of thousand of parts per plane. And then you compare that to the F-35, and it's hundreds of thousands of parts that go into an F-35 jet today. And it's like, look, yeah, we can have a World War II era plane. They weren't very sophisticated. I mean, they flew and they could drop a bomb. I was talking to another investor just last week, and they were like, why can't we build bombs like we used to? And it's like, well, they're precision guided warheads that can be dropped within inches of a certain person, diffused if the camera on this bomb doesn't see the target. They will diffuse in themselves so that no one is injured to limited collateral damage. In World War II, we just dropped ordnance out the side of the door.
But
I mean, it's like a totally different level of functionality. And so, I mean, to me, there's this comparison of, drugs that were just from plants that we sort of process versus the kind of modern drugs where there is serious manufacturing that goes into an mRNA vaccine that didn't exist with, let's say, SOX vaccine, 50, 60 years ago.
But have we associated with complexity with functionality? And the thing I'm particularly thinking of was this picture from, I don't know, a week or two ago from SpaceX, and like the evolution of, I think it's the Raptor rocket, and like the third generation is less material, it's less complex, and maybe that's it. We're now getting that shift. Is we always assumed you had to be more to get more functional, we had to be more complicated, and now there's this moment of, well, maybe we don't. Maybe we can start thinking in new ways there are ways to be more functional but less complicated.
I think that's an important observation. I mean, look, Anduril, one of Lux's major companies, I think you could argue their entire thesis is basically come here, use commercially off the shelf parts, build it into a request from the Pentagon, produce it super fast, make it highly reliable, use less parts, make it less complicated, make it single use. Suddenly, you don't have an F-35 that has to do 25 different missions. You have different units, each of which individually is 1,000th the cost, but handles one mission really, really well. And then that works. So I do think that model comes in. A big part of that does come from private industry, right? And competition and trying to lower costs. We're seeing that not just in the US, you see this within Turkey, the Bayraktar TB2 drones that are being used in Ukraine. We see this with some other nations' defense industries where they can't compete with the 5 US defense primes. And so they are just much more efficient at producing parts. But I think software is a good example where software never seems to get smaller. Like no one ever pulls software out, right? The number of lines of code almost always goes up. We almost never see like, look, macOS 10, 25% less lines of code than last time. You can't sell that, even though that's probably a good thing for reducing surface area, would reduce bugs. You kind of have less to code, therefore it's easier to evaluate, it's easier to test, it's easier to ensure that it's correct.
Do you think that's a culture issue that's been going on, and hardware, because of literal capital costs, if I make it less and I make it physically smaller, it costs less, so there's an incentive to making it less?
I think you see the best culture around software in the open source community where, a library like OpenSSL, which is used basically in every computer, every device, every transaction you do in the internet, is a very like abstracted, well organized project, particularly after they had a little bit of a bug 10 years ago that brought a lot of attention to them. But you see a lot of these packages that are well composed where it's like, look, it does one thing, it does it extremely well, it's been verified, tested, and it's not adding a lot of new functionality, right? It doesn't have to change all the time. The problem is that so many of our products touch end users where it's like Office or Teams, to pick very unpopular software. They have to constantly add new features because they're competing. People are competing with them. They feel the need to keep adding things. Every time I go into a Teams, I'm like, oh God, we have to be in Teams again. This is so terrible.
I'm glad I'm not the only one that has that reaction.
Yeah,
Especially recently I had someone in a Teams meeting that was like, you must update it. I was like, no, I can't update right now. I've got the call in like 6 seconds.
Yes. I always love I will say, I mean, it's so bad. I always joke, if it's like, the level of the person will dictate whether I accept the Teams Cal invite or not. Like, sometimes you get in and I'm just being nice and meeting someone and I'm like, okay, you're not worth a Teams meeting for me. But like, look, like, why is that? Because there's 100 million requirements that are placed on them for security and privacy, and enterprise want all these tools. And so there's just complexity, just layers and layers of complexity of that tool. When at some level it is just like, it's just video chat. Like it could be off the shelf in a couple of lines of code. There are libraries that handle video transmission, encoding. You can use off the shelf that could be reused across different applications. Microsoft rolls it all in its own in a multi-gigabyte app.
Yeah, the whole point I loved the fact that we had the collaboration stack. Was what Teams was. It was just a
Right.
stack of like the worst of all of them.
Yeah. Well, I think and so where does innovation happen, right? I think you look at like Notion, and I'm thinking like very early Notion. When Notion showed up, people were like, this is incredible because it's integrating a little bit of Airtable, a little bit of Excel, a little bit of like contacts. And on smaller projects, it has just enough of all these like other tools all kind of combined together to be a useful tool. Now, it's interesting because Notion's now a massive company. It's used for like full companies, and it's kind of an awkward tool beyond a certain point, right? It doesn't scale to 1,000 users all trying to use one big ass database. It's great for a 10-person team where you have to track customer leads and sales, and there's a Gantt chart and you need timelines, and all that needs to be kind of in one home. Where Google Docs would say, like, have a separate spreadsheet, have a separate doc. So I always think there's a little bit of disruption for a new simple player to come in and say, and you see this in, I mean, just go down the list, like Photoshop. Photoshop's still great, but it has like 20 million features. And for most folks, it's like there's a whole suite of different apps out there today that are $25, $50, $100 that do 80% of Photoshop's features. And now it's a really compressed, nice product. And that works for most folks. If you're a top professional and you need the best, that's great. But we do see that kind of premium, I think they used to call it prosumer. But I do hope to see more of that in more industries.
So I want to jump to kind of like the last topic here that we were going to talk about, which was kind of ecosystems. And one of the things we were kind of going around with is you guys recently published a column called "Hacking Primordial Soup" with I'm just going to say Yuta because it said the Sri Lankan, and I'm going to butcher his name if I try anything more than that. But it was a great article, and he kind of was examining, and I'll link to it in the show notes, Shenzhen, Singapore, Bangalore, Taiwan. And the part that I really resonated with me, and this was kind of your tweet thread about it, was you said here, like, it mirrored the early hacker days of Silicon Valley, where small markets and scrappy entrepreneurs led to groundbreaking innovations. And then also from the article itself, which I really liked, was this was talking about Shenzhen. It marries cheap hardware, open markets at nearly unprecedented scale. And what I liked about it was, and this is kind of what I ended up tweeting about, was I think that ecosystems have specific first principles. And it was interesting. I had somebody on who wrote a book called Centers of Progress, 40 Cities That Changed the World. And it was really interesting because I recently had gotten kind of a little obsessed with like Paris in the 1920s. And it was great because like, oh, she's got this in the book. And it wasn't Paris in the 1920s. It was Paris in the 1600s. But if you kind of just covered it up a little bit, you're like, oh, there's actually, it feels like Paris in the 1920s. They were just talking about different things and doing. So there was a very much of a still first principles in that. And my theory is if you have those first principles of ecosystems, and then you kind of layer on the sectors of the moment, when the sector, the company, and the capital all line up, that's when you really have kind of that generational outcome. So the point being, if you want to be building foundational AI, you probably should get your ass to San Francisco. If you want to build the next big like cell therapy company, you should probably be in Boston. When I think about being selfish in Austin for a second, I think about the convergence of the digital and the physical, that makes a lot of sense in Austin. And so when you kind of see these different kinds of companies and these different things, I think that makes a lot of sense. So when it's the Shenzhen, it's like, yeah, this kind of the cheap market, the hardware, that was kind of back to that first principles of Shenzhen. So first, do you think I'm completely off base in kind of my thinking? And then I know you guys are in New York and you kind of invest all over. I mean, what do you think about the differences of kind of some of these ecosystems?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about first principles, I mean, first and foremost, you have to have a place that supports the kind of work that you want to see done. So I actually come from an artistic background in this kind of mentality, which is like, look, painters, there's a paint shop down the street from me. It's up until 4 a.m. You might think, why the hell is a paint shop that sells like brushes and paints open till 4 a.m.? Guess when artists work, or at least some artists work, right? They're waking up. I have an artist friend, wakes up at 9 p.m. and paints until 4 a.m. Because that's it. When it's quiet, people aren't around, he's not distracted, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have to have that paint job. There was no paints. He runs out of a green or whatever the case. I'm sort of exaggerating, but you run out of green. What are you going to stop your whole painting for that night because you don't have paint? That he goes straight down to the store, picks it up, goes back to work, and has a good conversation, whatever the case may be, and is back in the groove. And so when you look at places like Shenzhen, yes, these are like electronics artists. They're building a new tool, they're building a new phone, and Yuta has a lot of great examples of this. But it's one of those where it's like, oh, I'm missing a very specific part in order to make this work. I can just walk out my door down the street. Someone knows exactly what I need. And if they don't have it, they can actually make it right there on the spot. And I'm walking home in 10 minutes, continuing my project. And I think that's very different from a mentality of like Amazon next day. When you're in a flow state, and I'm sure you've read Flow or at least know the book, but, popular in all Silicon Valley circles. But, flow states, you don't have to be down to the minute in a flow state. But I do think that idea of like, well, I have to do it next, tomorrow, I have to do it the next day, that loop is the difference, right? So if you're an AI in San Francisco and you get stuck on a bug and you have a very smart scientist who lives on your flat on the same floor and you're Victorian and you say, hey, what's going on over here? Oh, here's what you did wrong. Now you're back in the flow. You just saved, yes, it was 10 minutes, but the point here is your flow didn't get interrupted. Whereas maybe in another city or in the Midwest or whatever, that might have taken 2 or 3 days or maybe 2 weeks. And that flow kind of gets disrupted and you just can't build. So I think that's part A. Your second question was, are there differences? Or obviously there are differences, but observations of different ecosystems. I think what's interesting is obviously there's sort of this, because tech has gotten so big, millions of people are in tech. This is not 15 years ago where YC, when it had jumped over to Silicon Valley, was 10 teams, right? There were 25 founders. It's hard to believe how small. And people forget that Y Combinator was founded in Boston, right? The first cohort of it, the first 7
I
folks
had no idea
were
that.
in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? And Paul Graham, who was very attached to Harvard and the Cambridge ecosystem, really believed there's a lot there. Was like, look, I think it has to be where the capital is, and ends up moving it. It's actually, I think, one of those definitive, was Y Combinator the cause of Silicon Valley or Silicon Valley the cause of Y Combinator? It's hard to know. But clearly, like, there was a linchpin for Boston that was lost. But to me, because there's millions of people in the industry today, it's a little bit hard to pick out differences because so many people flow from one place to the other. Before the show, we were talking about how many folks have moved from Silicon Valley to Austin. Thousands of folks have made that migration. And so is Austin culture just different, or is it just all the Silicon Valley emigres? Same with Miami, same with New York, is just flooded with folks from Silicon Valley who want a better lifestyle and working public transit. So I think there's like a common culture, and then yes, there are variations. I mean, even within a city, I think of New York as a place where crypto is along the L line here in Brooklyn. A lot of AI is in Dumbo. One of our companies, Runway, is down there. You have kind of the
Little
old
micro
traditional
hubs even
little
within.
micro hubs.
Yeah.
And by the way, why do micro hubs exist? Because it's neighborhoods. You can walk over to those offices, right? You can go get a drink with people who are in the same industry, doing the same problems as you. And that advantage of in-person interaction is impossible to beat.
No, look, Danny, this has been a whole lot of fun, and we went all over the place, and I think didn't even talk about half the stuff we were going to talk about. I always like to end with the same question: what's next?
I have been really obsessed with xenotransplantation. We already talked about it a little bit. This is a very good example of a place where the first couple of patients, if you go back to the history of the artificial heart, there was a person who got the first artificial heart. They're the first person with a mechanical heart that was operating and beating inside them. It was flowing blood to all of their extremities, and it was revolutionary. And it took years for people to sort of understand. It was actually Minnesota, my home state. And it expanded and obviously changed the life of hundreds of thousands of people. The same thing is going to happen with xenotransplantation. There are, hundreds of thousands of people waiting on wait lists for organs a day. Technology exists to potentially give them organs in relatively short order. And to me, it's sort of a national priority to move that very, very quickly, to make that happen fast. We've had the first successful cases. And so the ability to potentially save hundreds of thousands of lives in the next decade, I think it's going to shock people how quickly this happens over the next 6 years.
I think xenotransplantation and organ regeneration and a lot of the stuff of just ending the kind of the organ shortage, I think is a huge wave coming.
That's what's next. That's extremely exciting to me.
Danny Crichton from Lux Capital, thank you so much for joining.
Jason, thanks for hosting.
So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey. Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.